Over 1,000 generations of humankind have tried to tame this vast planet, clearing the forests, burning the grasslands, mining the hills, tilling the valleys. Great civilizations have come and gone, consuming the riches of the earth and dumping their spoils over land and sea. Yet because human populations were limited, natural processes could continue to heal the scars and diffuse the wastes which they made. With the introduction of fertilizers, pesticides, and heavy farm machinery, agriculture flourished, accelerating the rapid growth of people and machines. It took until 1850 for the world's population to reach 1 billion. Yet by 1920, it had doubled to 2 billion. And by 1960, it had passed 3 billion. Growth was everywhere. With the opening up of the new American continent, it seems natural to assume that our natural resources were infinite. 1 billion acres of wilderness. Such an abundance of trees and minerals hastened the mushrooming of resource-consuming industries. With incredible speed, that great American wilderness disappeared, and with it, the wealth of natural resources. By the end of World War II, the United States had alone used up more resources in the last 40 years than the entire world had used up in the last 4,000 years. Each year, more than 1 billion trees are cut down in America, quite a sizable bite out of the 600 million acres of remaining forest land, over half of which is already owned by commercial forestry interests. While more trees are planted than are cut in the West, the East, with 3/4 of the nation's forest land, provides only 1/4 of the nation's timber. The trees just aren't growing fast enough to meet the demand. In the past, most timbering was done by the individual selection of trees, which meant the lumber could be taken, yet the forest would remain. Now, over 60% of all lumber operations are clear-cut, leaving great scars across the landscape and completely destroying the local environment. Non-renewable minerals that we mine each year to satisfy our industrial appetite can never actually disappear from the face of the earth. They will just be dispersed in the oceans and scattered all over the globe in graveyards and dumps in cities. There are numerous figures and tables and computer printouts available today which attempt to pinpoint when certain resources will be, for all practical purposes, no longer available. Gold, 1981. Mercury, 1985. Lead, 1993, for example. But whether or not these extrapolations are accurate, one thing is certain. There will come a time when our resources will cease to be economically available, unless the world quickly realizes that the only real, long-term solution is to conserve and recycle. Fossil fuels, such as oil and natural gas, are replenished by nature, but it took 250 million years to produce the oil which we are now consuming at a rate of 2 million tons a day. That means that no matter how many new oil fields are found, new pipelines built, or oil shale deposits mined, we will run out of the fossil fuels which now run our cars, heat our homes, and power our factories. And it may happen before the end of this century. Nuclear power is rapidly expanding throughout the world. Here we run into a new dimension of trouble. Nuclear wastes remain radioactive and harmful to humans for sometimes thousands of years. These wastes must be carefully stored and guarded until they become inactive, and many of these wastes require constant cooling to prevent melting their container. The disposing of nuclear wastes is quite an obvious problem, but to millions of Americans, the more familiar problem of disposing of ordinary household wastes is not so obvious. even though it is fast becoming the nation's #1 domestic problem. For while we are running out of resources on the one hand, we are burying ourselves under growing mountains of trash on the other. Every day, each person in the United States discards between 3 and 5 pounds of trash. Yearly, this adds up to some 200 pounds of paper, 135 bottles, and 250 metal cans per person. If industrial and demolition wastes are included, the daily per capita figure rises to nearly 10 pounds. On the national scale, this adds up to over 250 million tons of domestic waste per year. Agricultural and mineral wastes raise this amount to well over 4 billion tons of solid waste per year. The cost of disposing of all this rubbish is as staggering as the volume. In New York City, it costs the taxpayers 30 cents for every discarded bottle which has to be picked up from along the roadside. In 1972, cities across the country paid a total of $4.5 billion in solid waste disposal. This cost is expected to double or even triple by 1980. Much of this waste is still abandoned in open-air dumps across the nation. 9/10 of these dumps are either very poorly managed or not managed at all, creating serious effects on the environment through water and air pollution, filling up our valuable open spaces, breeding disease, and ending the line for reusable resources. The Environmental Protection Agency has recently been making a valiant effort to close down open-air dumps in the U.S., but they still remain the major type of disposal. Sanitary landfills, which are beginning to replace many open-air dumps as required by state laws, are often no better than the original dumps. 40% of them use no dirt cover at all, and 75% of them use some form of burning, which means they are still causing a health hazard and a pollution problem. Those which are properly managed still use up a great deal of land, and while when filled they can be used for parks and golf courses, they are normally unsuitable for any kind of building due to sinkage and methane gas buildups which could explode under the pressure of a building. Incineration has become necessary for many urban communities where land is scarce or prohibitively expensive. There are presently about 500 central incinerators in this country, handling about 10% of our wastes. While properly run incinerators can dispose of waste cleanly and efficiently, 3/4 of the incinerators in America are apparently not properly run. Cities all over the world are taking a closer look at the solid waste problem. Wastes are increasing, costs are increasing, land is becoming scarce, and yet all we seem to be looking for is the cheapest method of disposal. This is unfortunate, because in fact, no method of disposal is satisfactory, for there can be no good way to dispose of wastes when they shouldn't be disposed of at all. We can no longer afford to consider wastes as a dead end. We are throwing away our last resource. In nature, nothing is wasted. The biosphere, which holds all life on Earth, runs on a complex system of cycles which have managed to support life for millions of years without ever running out of essential resources. Humankind is changing this natural pattern, however, cutting down trees and upsetting the balance of oxygen, polluting the rivers, upsetting the flow of pure water, using man-made chemicals on crops and destroying the cycle of nitrogen. As a result, we are not only running out of resources and piling up wastes, we are jeopardizing our very survival on Earth, because the biosphere, with all its complex interrelated cycles, is a very fragile mechanism, and we are now affecting its operation on a global scale with far-reaching results which scientists are only beginning to discover. Recycling is clearly a necessity. Recycling the thrown-away paper to make new paper. Recycling the dumped glass to make new glass. Recycling the junked steel to make new steel. What could be simpler? Actually, recycling is not new. Some paper mills have been making cardboard out of recycled paper for over 100 years. Scrap metal has been remelted and used over probably since the Iron Age. In America, recycling was at a peak during World War II, when some resources needed for the war effort were in short supply. Families separated their own trash and salvaged large quantities of newspapers, tin cans, cooking grease, and cigarette coils because they recognized that available resources were limited and everyone had to pitch in. After the war came the largest boom of industrial growth in history, and once again, everyone assumed the world's resources were unlimited. Except for the work of groups like the Salvation Army, collecting old newspapers and worn-out clothes, recycling disappeared from everyday American life, and it was really not until Earth Day 1970 that the idea was revived and brought to the attention of millions of ecology-minded citizens. Meanwhile, however, a newly thriving industry was promoting recycling backstage, the salvage industry, mainly interested in scrap iron and steel, but also involved in recycling other non-ferrous metals, paper, textiles, rubber, and plastics. This industry has dealt primarily with manufacturers, turning one industry's wastes into another's resources, and salvaging broken bottles, paper shreds, steel donut holes, and other odds and ends to feed right back into the assembly lines. By 1970, this industry had grown to include over 80,000 employees, making annual sales of nearly $8 billion, and it is this industry which is responsible for almost all the recycling which now takes place. Between 40 and 50% of all domestic solid waste is recyclable paper, mainly in the form of packaging and newsprint. In Japan, over half of this paper is recycled. In the United States, less than 20% is recycled. Between 1960 and 1970, consumption of paper and paper products increased 70%, which means recycling will have to double in 15 years just to stay even. Already we are feeling the pinch of a paper shortage. In 1900, there were 11 acres of forest land per person in the U.S. In 1970, there were less than 3 acres. And by 1985, there will be an estimated 1.5 acres per person. Trees are probably our most valuable natural resource. They supply us with wildlife and food, shelter and shade. They support our national communication system. They provide fuel and electricity, as well as paper for the nation's business. Recycling paper instead of using pulp means that fewer trees must be cut down. In fact, every ton of recycled paper saves about 17 full-grown trees from the teeth of a chainsaw. There are now about 100 paper mills in the U.S. which recycle to some extent. Most of the recycled pulp is used for making paperboard and corrugated cardboard. Less than 20% is bleached and processed into fine writing papers and newsprint. At the mill, waste paper is dumped into a hydropulper, where it is ground up and separated into fibers. Each time paper is recycled, some of the fibers break up and become too small to use for making new paper. These fibers are filtered out as the recycled pulp passes through elaborate tunnels and chemical baths, which remove dirt, staples, and other materials to prepare the pulp for the paper-making machine. Here the pulp is squeezed through rollers and dried out until it is the right thickness and consistency. By this time, almost half the original paper has been removed as additives or foreign materials. Shiny magazine paper is coated with clay, which easily washes off. An increasing amount of cardboard is being saturated with wax for waterproofing, and just recently, a method was developed for removing this wax and reclaiming the cardboard. Even plastic films and adhesives can be removed from paper and separated so that virtually all paper and paper products are technologically recyclable. Recycled paper is far from inferior to virgin paper. Newsprint made from recycled fibers is actually superior to normal paper in printability and tear strength. Mixed paper waste has a strength comparable to medium-strength virgin pulps and can be made stronger with a chemical treatment. Highest quality waste paper can produce highest quality recycled paper without any noticeable difference whatsoever. Unfortunately, recycled paper so far is nothing more than a novelty, and even though it is simpler and cheaper to manufacture, requiring less energy and causing considerably less pollution, paper mills generally make little of it and sell it for a higher price. Glass recycling is a much newer idea, but it is quickly catching on across the country. About 25% of the glass manufactured each year is made into window panes and other glassware which contain lead. These products cannot be recycled because the lead is poisonous. Glass bottles and jars, however, are the major source of waste glass. They contain no lead and are completely recyclable. Over 1 billion bottles were recycled in 1973, but this represents less than 5% of the total glass containers produced. The waste glass, or cullet as it is called, must be free from all bottle claps and rings, because any metal which gets into the furnace will melt at the high temperatures and contaminate the glass. Glass is normally made from sand, soda, ash, and limestone, with between 5 and 20% cullet added. Most of this cullet comes from broken bottles and mistakes made in the factory. In fact, when efficiency is running high, some factories actually make excess bottles to use as cullet in the next batch. This cullet is very valuable to a glass plant because it liquefies at a lower temperature than the basic raw materials. As a result, the use of cullet can lower fuel requirements and save energy, as well as extend the life of the furnace liners. In spite of this, glass plants rarely use more than 20% cullet, even though perfectly acceptable glass can be made from as much as 100% cullet. Recycling glass is certainly much better than throwing it away, but even better than recycling is conserving and reusing. Returnable bottles, which have been cleaned and reused since the origin of the bottling industry, are now yielding to the so-called convenience of no deposit, no return bottles. The average returnable bottle was reused 14 times before it was put out of service. The non-returnable bottle is used once and then either discarded or recycled at an unnecessary expenditure of valuable energy. The story of the no deposit, no return bottle is the sad story of our American waste economy. The real irony of recycling glass containers is that this encourages the use of non-returnable bottles and makes almost impossible the return of the returnables. Aluminum is another resource which has recently grown in popularity, and on the litter front, this is posing a serious problem. As our litter-happy society continues to decorate our roadsides with beer cans, the aluminum cans promise to stay around long after steel cans have rusted away to oblivion. Aluminum companies are trying to help out by setting up can recycling centers, and well they should, because processing secondary aluminum is considerably less expensive and requires only 5% the electricity needed to produce virgin aluminum. Yet, in spite of this and their $200 a ton incentive, less than 1/6 of these cans are presently recycled. In 1971, the steel industry claimed 50% of their steel was scrap. However, over half of this scrap never left the steel mill. Outside of this factory waste, the automobile is the largest contributor of scrap. In 1972, there were an estimated 20 million junk cars abandoned across the American landscape. This represents scrap metal worth over $1 billion, yet the heap just keeps growing, as over 1 million old cars are added to it each year. One might think the scrap industry would want to take advantage of this gold mine and help alleviate this national problem. The recycling industry has its own problems, however. Steel mills are located near the iron ore, not near the scrap. Thus, transportation is a major problem, especially when the federal government has set up shipping rates which favor raw materials and discriminate against waste products. Rail freight charges run as much as 50% higher for scrap iron ore than for iron ore. In addition, the federal government provides special depletion allowances to mining companies, giving them an economic advantage over scrap dealers, and making it very difficult for scrap to compete with ore for the market. Before 1950, steel-making furnaces were equipped to handle about 60% scrap and 40% ore. Since then, virtually all furnaces in the United States have been converted to handle only 40% scrap and 60% ore. Large-scale scrap reprocessors are thus forced to ship thousands of tons of scrap to Europe each year, where steel furnaces still run on 60% scrap. Steel and aluminum are not the only metals that are recycled. Nearly half the nation's copper is made from scrap, and more lead now comes from scrap than from the mines. In fact, there is really nothing that we now throw away which does not have some application as a resource. On the industrial scale, even plastics are being recycled. Excellent fertilizer is made from sewage and compost. The problem is, it's not the steel cans beside the road, or the bills in the wastebasket, or the packaging on all the Christmas presents that's being recycled. It's all industry to industry, so the solid waste still piles up, and the trees still fall down. Since Earth Day 1970, over 3,000 recycling centers have been established across the country, collecting newspapers, bottles, and cans on a monthly, weekly, or even full-time basis. Industries seem reluctant, however, to accept much more waste material than they are already receiving from the scrap industry. Scrap from the recycling centers is usually contaminated somewhat and more difficult to handle than pure homogeneous factory scrap. Market prices fluctuate incredibly, and many people tend to think of recycled products as inferior, which means the demand for such products is low. And without a demand, there is no recycling. The success of recycling depends upon the mutual cooperation of everyone. Help is needed from all levels of government and industry, but most of all from you. By purchasing recycled products and recycling your own trash, you can take pride in the trees you are saving and the profits you are bringing to your own community. The United States of America, with only 6% of the world's population, consumes more than a third of the world's resources and produces almost two-thirds of the world's solid waste. Somewhere, something has gone very wrong. We can no longer afford to treat our planet like a wastebasket or a bottomless horn of plenty. Recycling offers a solution to both mounting wastes and exhausting resources. We must all take the initiative to ensure its success. We must leave a healthy planet for our children and our children's children.